Ethan stared at the fading photograph on the mantel. A sepia-toned snapshot of his parents smiling in front of their quaint, ivy-covered house. The house had been his sanctuary, a constant in his life through tumultuous years. It wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was a legacy. Sophie often joked about how attached he was to it, calling him sentimental, but Ethan never minded. He had built a life with Sophie that he believed was steady, honest, and true. Their marriage on the surface was ideal. Two people who laughed at the same jokes, shared whispered secrets before bed, and always backed each other up in public. Yet recently Sophie had been acting off. It wasn't just her newfound obsession with Lena's business venture, which she called life-changing. It was her veiled remarks about Ethan being too attached to the past and how they should focus on the future. Ethan tried to ignore the faint, niggling doubt, but the cracks in their perfect picture were becoming harder to dismiss. And when Sophie invited Lena over for dinner that evening, bringing more glossy brochures and an overly rehearsed pitch, Ethan felt a chill in his gut that no wine could warm. The evening played out like an elaborate performance, with Sophie and Lena as the stars of the show. They sat across from Ethan at the dinner table, their excitement palpable as they discussed Lena's once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity. The startup, a vaguely defined app development company, promised massive returns on minimal investment. Sophie's eyes sparkled as she described the potential profits, her hand brushing Ethan's arm as she cooed about their dream future. Ethan nodded politely, but his thoughts churned. Sophie's enthusiasm felt forced, her words rehearsed. Lena, on the other hand, was unervingly direct. She leaned forward, her tone commanding. "Ethan, selling the house is the smartest move. It's old, falling apart, and frankly, holding you both back." She smiled tightly. "That money could transform your lives. You'd be set." Ethan swallowed his irritation, responding with practiced calm. "I'll think about it." Sophie's smile faltered for a second before she caught herself. "It's not just about the money, Ethan. It's about us. Our future. Don't you want to move forward together?" The word "together" lingered in the air, but it felt less like a promise and more like a trap. Later, as they cleared the table, Ethan caught Sophie exchanging a look with Lena. A brief, knowing glance that sent a jolt of unease through him. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, their plan closing in like a tightening noose. That night, as Sophie slept beside him, Ethan stared at the ceiling, the seed of doubt growing roots in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. The following weeks felt like an unrelenting campaign. Sophie ramped up her efforts, casually dropping mentions of the house's deteriorating plumbing, the outdated kitchen, and how exhausting it was to maintain. "It's time to let go, Ethan," she said one morning over coffee, her tone deceptively gentle. "We could have something so much better. Lena's idea isn't just an investment. It's a chance to build a future." Ethan, biting back a sharp retort, simply nodded. "I'll need more time to think." But thinking was the last thing Sophie seemed to want him to do. She started leaving glossy business reports on his desk, highlighting impressive, if dubious, projections. Lena visited more frequently, always armed with the same predatory charm and an uncanny ability to steer conversations toward the house sale. Ethan began noticing things he hadn't before. The hushed phone calls Sophie took in the bathroom, the way her eyes flickered with unease when he asked pointed questions about Lena's company, and how she always seemed to deflect when he pressed her for details. One evening, Ethan came home early from work, his stomach tightening as he heard low laughter drifting from the living room. Quietly, he moved closer and caught Sophie and Lena on the couch, their heads bent together over her laptop. "This is going to work," Lena said, her voice carrying a conspiratorial edge. "Once it's done, he'll thank you." Sophie's laugh was soft, nervous. "I hope so. He's so attached to that house. It's like prying a toy from a child." Ethan felt his stomach churn. He backed away silently, his mind racing. The warmth in Sophie's tone wasn't convincing. It sounded more like a plea for reassurance. Something about the whole arrangement reeked of dishonesty, and Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. The house wasn't just a piece of property. It was a part of him, and the way Sophie and Lena spoke about it, as if it were some obstacle to be removed, sent a cold rage coursing through his veins. That night, Ethan made a decision. If they were hiding something, he was going to find out. Ethan's suspicions consumed him. He began paying closer attention, watching Sophie's movements and listening more intently during her conversations. The clues were subtle, but they started to stack up. Late one evening, Sophie received a call while they were watching TV. She muted the show, smiling apologetically. "It's Lena. Just a quick thing about the business." She disappeared into the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. Ethan followed silently, careful to keep out of sight. Her voice was low, but the tension in her tone betrayed her. "We'll get it, Lena," Sophie was saying, frustration creeping into her voice. "He's dragging his feet, but he'll give in. He always does." A pause, then laughter, sharp and bitter. "You're right. He wouldn't survive on his own, anyway. He's too safe, too scared to take risks. That's why he needs me." Ethan clenched his fists, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through him. He retreated before Sophie could notice him and spent the rest of the night piecing together what he'd heard. The next day, Ethan acted on impulse. While Sophie was out, he rifled through her office, searching for anything that might confirm his suspicions. Amidst a sea of papers and receipts, he found a small notebook tucked in the back of a drawer. Flipping through it, he saw hastily scribbled notes in Sophie's handwriting. Some entries were innocuous, grocery lists and reminders, but others struck like a dagger to the chest. "Sell house by end of Q2. Convince him - emotional appeal. Discuss split of returns with Lena after sale." His pulse raced as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just about the house or a business venture. Sophie and Lena had been scheming, manipulating him like a chess piece. But why? And why did Sophie seem so desperate? That night, Ethan confronted Sophie indirectly, testing her reaction. Over dinner, he casually asked, "What happens if Lena's business doesn't take off?" Sophie stiffened, her smile faltering for a moment before she recovered. "It will. Lena's done all the research. She's brilliant at this sort of thing." "And if it fails?" he pressed. Sophie shrugged, feigning indifference. "Well, that's the risk with any investment. But we have to take chances to grow, don't we?" Her words rang hollow, and her forced smile didn't reach her eyes. Ethan nodded but said nothing more. That night, as Sophie slept, Ethan began planning. If they were going to play a game, he would make sure they never saw his next move coming. Ethan's rage simmered beneath a mask of calm. He couldn't confront Sophie outright, not yet. She was too adept at twisting conversations, too skilled at turning herself into the victim. Instead, Ethan resolved to beat Sophie and Lena at their own game. The first step was to protect the house. Ethan met privately with a lawyer, transferring ownership of the property into a trust with only his name listed as the beneficiary. The trust would shield the house from any potential sale Sophie tried to push through, ensuring its safety no matter what happened. Once the legalities were in place, Ethan played the role of the dutiful, unsuspecting husband. Over the next few weeks, he pretended to warm to the idea of selling the house, even agreeing to tour a few prospective properties with Sophie. She seemed elated by his change in attitude, her guard lowering just enough for Ethan to gather more information. During one of these outings, Sophie let slip that Lena had already spoken to potential buyers for the house. "It's a hot market," she said casually, as if they weren't conspiring behind his back. Ethan nodded, feigning interest. "Well, if it's going to help us, I suppose it's worth considering." Sophie's eyes lit up. "It's the right choice, Ethan. You'll see." What Sophie didn't know was that Ethan had been digging deeper into Lena's business. Through a private investigator, he uncovered that Lena's so-called startup was a front, a shell company with no actual operations or assets. The financial projections Sophie had shown him were fabricated, and Lena had a history of pulling similar scams on unwitting investors. Ethan's findings filled him with both dread and determination. Sophie wasn't just complicit in this scheme. She was actively helping Lena manipulate him. But why? Was it greed? Blind loyalty? Or something deeper? The answer came one evening when Ethan returned home early. He heard voices coming from the living room, Sophie and Lena, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Ethan approached quietly, stopping just short of the doorway. "It's almost done," Sophie was saying. "He's starting to trust me again." "Good," Lena replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Once we close the deal, we'll have everything we need. You'll finally be free." "Free," Sophie echoed, her tone unsure. Lena's voice softened, taking on a more intimate edge. "Free of him. Free to be with me, the way we've always talked about." Ethan froze. The words hung in the air like a knife poised to strike. "I know," Sophie said after a pause, her voice trembling. I need to handle this carefully. He can't suspect anything." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The betrayal was more profound than he'd imagined. This wasn't just about money. Sophie and Lena had been lovers, using him as a pawn in their twisted game. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding. His initial anger flared into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was war. Ethan spent the next few days in quiet, methodical preparation. Every glance, every word, every touch from Sophie felt like acid burning his skin, but he kept his composure. He had to. Letting them know he was onto them would ruin everything. His first move was to tighten the legal protections around his assets. Beyond securing the house and the trust, he discreetly opened a new bank account, transferring the bulk of their shared savings into it. He left just enough in the joint account to avoid suspicion, knowing Sophie and Lena would be monitoring it. Next, he contacted the private investigator again, instructing him to dig into Lena's personal life. He wanted everything: financial records, communications, anything that could be used as leverage. Ethan wasn't above playing dirty. They'd chosen this battlefield, and he'd fight on their terms. The investigator delivered results quickly. Lena's financial troubles were worse than Ethan had anticipated. Her startup was a facade for a failing scheme, and she was deeply in debt. More damning, however, were the records of her communication with Sophie. Texts and emails between the two revealed not only their romantic involvement, but also their detailed plans to manipulate Ethan into selling the house. One email in particular made his blood run cold. "Once the house is sold, we can disappear. He'll never see it coming. I'll make sure he doesn't fight back. It's easier that way. Just stick to the plan, sophomore." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling a surge of icy resolve. They wanted to erase him, strip him of everything he held dear. But they had underestimated him. The final step in his preparation was subtle psychological warfare. Ethan began leaving small hints that he might be catching on. He'd casually mention obscure details about Lena's business, watching Sophie's reaction. He'd leave legal documents on the kitchen counter, harmless ones, but enough to make Sophie uneasy. One night, as they sat down to dinner, Ethan deliberately brought up the house. "I've been thinking," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Maybe we should hold off on selling. The market's good now, but it could be even better in a year." Sophie's fork froze halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting to his. "Why would we wait? I thought we agreed it's the right time." Ethan shrugged. "It's a big decision. I just want to make sure we're doing the right thing." Sophie forced a smile, but her tension was palpable. "We are. Trust me." Ethan smiled back, his face a mask of calm. "Of course. I trust you." But trust, he thought, was the last thing they deserved. Ethan's patience was wearing thin, but he knew the timing had to be perfect. He continued playing the part of the complacent husband, agreeing to Sophie's plans and even attending a meeting with Lena to discuss the house sale. Lena dominated the conversation as usual. She outlined potential buyers, all mysteriously connected to her network. Ethan feigned interest, nodding at her suggestions while mentally noting every inconsistency in her pitch. At one point, Lena leaned in with that predatory smile he had come to despise. "Once the house sells, you'll be sitting on a pile of cash. Think of all the opportunities that'll open up for you and Sophie." Ethan forced a smile. "You're right. I'm sure this is the best move for us." The words tasted bitter, but they served their purpose. Sophie visibly relaxed, her shoulders losing some of their tension. Later that evening, Ethan put the second phase of his plan into motion. He sent an anonymous tip to a local financial crimes investigator about Lena's fraudulent activities. He included copies of her fabricated business records and evidence of her debts, ensuring they had enough to launch an inquiry. At the same time, Ethan began planting seeds of doubt in Sophie's mind. He casually mentioned overhearing a neighbor complain about a botched real estate deal, adding, "It's funny how people can seem trustworthy until they're not." Sophie flinched at his words, her smile faltering. "Lena's not like that," she said quickly, almost defensively. "Of course not," Ethan replied smoothly. "I was just saying it happens sometimes. People get greedy." The conversation ended there, but Sophie's unease was evident. As the days passed, Ethan watched Sophie and Lena grow more restless. Their hushed phone calls became more frequent, their behavior increasingly erratic. One evening, Sophie came to bed late, her face pale and her movements jittery. "Is everything okay?" Ethan asked, his tone laced with concern. Sophie hesitated before nodding. "Just a lot on my mind. Lena's stressed about the business." Ethan reached over, brushing a hand against hers. "You've been working so hard to support her. I'm proud of you." Sophie blinked, clearly caught off guard by his words. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice unsteady. Ethan lay back, staring at the ceiling. The trap was set. All he needed now was for them to spring it. Ethan's opportunity came one stormy evening. Sophie had left the house abruptly after receiving a call from Lena, mumbling something vague about business. Suspicious, Ethan followed her. Keeping his distance, he tailed Sophie to a small apartment complex on the other side of town. She parked her car and hurried inside, her movements quick and furtive. Ethan waited in the shadows, the rain masking his presence as he watched the light flick on in one of the upper-floor windows. Through the thin curtains, he could make out two figures, Sophie and Lena. They stood close, speaking in animated tones. Ethan strained to make out their words but couldn't hear much over the rain. Then, without warning, Lena reached out and pulled Sophie into a kiss. It wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was the kiss of two people who had done this before, many times. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. His breath hitched, and for a moment he was paralyzed. The betrayal was no longer just financial or emotional. It was complete. As he stood there, soaked to the bone, their movements inside shifted. The kiss deepened, their bodies pressed against each other. Ethan looked away, bile rising in his throat. He forced himself to breathe, to push down the tidal wave of rage threatening to consume him. This wasn't the time to act out of anger. He needed control, precision. He needed to ensure they paid for every lie, every deception. When Sophie returned home later that night, she found Ethan sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Late night?" he asked, his voice calm. Sophie hesitated, her damp hair framing her face. "Yeah." Lena needed help with some last-minute business stuff. "You know how she is." Ethan nodded, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Always keeping you busy. She's lucky to have you." Sophie blinked, clearly thrown off by his response. "Thanks," she said, her tone uncertain. Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze steady on hers. "You must be exhausted. Go get some rest." Sophie mumbled a good night and disappeared down the hall. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening on the glass. The revelation of their affair wasn't just fuel for his revenge. It was the final confirmation that nothing about their relationship had ever been real. Ethan woke early the next morning, long before Sophie stirred. As he sipped his coffee, he scrolled through the photos and screenshots the private investigator had sent him. Lena and Sophie's emails, their damning plans to siphon money from the house sale, and, most recently, a blurry but unmistakable photo of their kiss. The pieces were all there. He had enough to dismantle them both, but he wanted them to feel it. He wanted their carefully constructed world to come crashing down around them. Sophie walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes and yawning. Ethan greeted her with a casual smile, sliding a plate of toast across the counter. "You're in a good mood," she remarked, her tone laced with suspicion. "Why wouldn't I be?" Ethan replied. "I've been thinking a lot about what you and Lena said, about the house. You're right. It's time to move forward." Sophie froze for a moment, then quickly masked her surprise. "Really? That's great, Ethan. I'm so glad you're on board." Ethan nodded. "I even made an appointment with a realtor to finalize the paperwork. We can get the ball rolling by next week." Sophie's smile faltered. "That's fast. Don't you think we should wait for Lena to handle the sale? She already has connections." Ethan shrugged. "Why involve Lena when we can do it ourselves? It'll be cleaner that way." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she gave a tight smile and excused herself, heading back to the bedroom. Ethan watched her retreat, knowing she'd be texting Lena the second she was out of sight. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but Ethan could sense the growing tension in Sophie. She avoided prolonged conversation, retreating to her phone every chance she got. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan casually dropped the first bombshell. "By the way, I had a meeting with the bank today." Sophie looked up from her phone, her face pale. "The bank?" "Yeah," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "Just making sure all our accounts are in order before we move forward. They flagged a few things, Lena's business, for example." Sophie stiffened, her fingers tightening around her phone. Why would the bank be looking into Lena's business? Ethan smiled, his expression calm but cold. "They found it interesting that all her assets are tied up in a shell company. Did you know that? Because I sure didn't." Sophie didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. Ethan let the words hang in the air, watching as the cracks in her facade grew deeper. "I'm just trying to be careful," Ethan added, his tone almost mocking. "Wouldn't want us to lose everything over a bad investment." Sophie muttered something about being tired and disappeared into the bedroom again. Ethan sat in the silence that followed, his mind racing with satisfaction. The game had begun in earnest, and Sophie had no idea how far he was willing to go. Ethan's calm demeanor over the next few days put Sophie on edge. He continued making casual remarks, hinting at details she thought he couldn't possibly know. Each time, her unease grew more visible. The turning point came when Ethan suggested a celebratory dinner at their favorite restaurant. "It's been a stressful few weeks," he said, his tone light. "We deserve a night out." Sophie hesitated but agreed, her forced smile betraying her nerves. That evening, Sophie dressed meticulously, her makeup impeccable. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at how well she played the role of a devoted wife. But he knew the truth now, and every look, every word, felt like a lie. They arrived at the restaurant, a cozy spot where they'd celebrated anniversaries in the past. Sophie seemed to relax slightly as the evening wore on. She even laughed at one of Ethan's jokes, the tension in her shoulders easing. When dessert arrived, Ethan leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "I have to say, Sophie," he began, his voice steady, "I've been impressed with how you've handled everything lately. The house, Lena's business. It's a lot to juggle." Sophie froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. I've just been trying to do what's best for us," she said carefully. Ethan nodded, setting his glass down. "That's why I thought it was only fair to bring Lena in tonight. After all, she's been such a big part of this." Sophie's eyes widened, her fork clattering onto the plate. "What do you mean?" Before she could say more, the waiter approached their table. "Mr. Wallace? Your guest has arrived." Lena walked in, her confidence faltering when she saw Ethan's steely gaze. She glanced at Sophie, who looked as though she might bolt at any moment. "Please sit," Ethan said, gesturing to the empty chair. "This is a conversation we should all have together." The room felt heavy as Lena sat down, her eyes darting between Sophie and Ethan. "I've been doing some thinking," Ethan began, his tone icy, "and some digging. Turns out your business, Lena, isn't quite what you've been selling it as. In fact, it's more of a scam." Lena stiffened, but before she could respond, Ethan turned his gaze to Sophie. And you, my loving wife, you've been in on this from the beginning, haven't you? Sophie's face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Did you think I wouldn't figure it out? The emails, the financial records, the plans to sell my home behind my back? Or maybe you thought I wouldn't find out about you too. Sophie's breath hitched, and Lena's expression turned to stone. Ethan leaned back, letting the weight of his words settle over them. Here's the thing, he said, his voice calm but laced with venom. The house is no longer in my name. It's protected. And the bank? They've flagged your business for fraud. Investigators should be knocking on your door any day now, Lena. Lena shot to her feet, her face a mask of fury. You don't know what you're talking about. Ethan smirked. Don't I? Go ahead, try me. Sophie reached for Lena's arm, her voice shaking. We need to leave. Now. Lena hesitated but ultimately followed Sophie out of the restaurant, their retreat chaotic and panicked. Ethan stayed behind, calmly finishing his wine. This was only the beginning. He had far more planned for the both of them. Ethan felt a dark sense of satisfaction as he watched Sophie and Lena rush out of the restaurant. The air was heavy with their panic, and he knew they'd spend the night frantically trying to salvage their crumbling scheme. He didn't wait for them to regroup. The next morning, Ethan began phase 2 of his revenge. First, he sent copies of Lena's fraudulent business records to local news outlets, including damning excerpts from her emails with Sophie. The emails painted a vivid picture of their manipulation, greed, and romantic involvement. Ethan ensured the journalists received a clear timeline, showing how they plotted to siphon money from the house sale and disappear together. By the afternoon, whispers of the scandal were circulating. Lena's name was quickly tied to her failing company, and Sophie's involvement as her accomplice and lover was highlighted in every report. Sophie, meanwhile, was frantically texting and calling Ethan. He ignored her. When Sophie finally showed up at the house, Ethan didn't slam the door in her face. Instead, he let her in, keeping his expression cold and unreadable. How could you do this to me? Sophie hissed, her voice trembling with both fury and fear. You've ruined my life. Ruined your life? Ethan repeated, his tone calm. You mean the life you built by betraying me? By trying to steal from me? Forgive me if I don't shed a tear. Sophie's anger gave way to desperation. Ethan, it wasn't like that. I was just trying to save it. Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp. I heard everything. Your plans, your lies. And I saw everything, too. Or have you forgotten about your little rendezvous with Lena? Sophie's face turned crimson. That's not fair. You don't understand. You're right, Ethan said, cutting her off again. I don't understand how you could stand there, night after night, pretending to love me while plotting to destroy everything we built. I don't understand how you could throw away years of trust for her. Sophie's lip quivered, but Ethan wasn't moved. You wanted freedom, didn't you? He continued. Well, congratulations. You're free now. Free of this house. Free of my money. Free of me. Before Sophie could respond, Ethan handed her a manila envelope. Consider this my parting gift. Inside were the divorce papers, along with a letter outlining the evidence Ethan had collected. He'd made it clear that if Sophie contested the divorce or tried to come after his assets, he wouldn't hesitate to escalate matters. This isn't over, Sophie spat, clutching the envelope. Oh, it is? Ethan said, his tone final. Get out. Sophie left, slamming the door behind her. Ethan stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. There was more to be done, but the first real blow had landed, and it felt damn good. Lena's unraveling came swiftly and brutally. The day after Ethan's evidence leaked, she was bombarded by reporters camped outside her office. Questions about the fraudulent business and her personal relationship with Sophie followed her everywhere. By evening, the Financial Crimes Division arrived at Lena's apartment with a warrant. Ethan had tipped off the authorities with more detailed evidence than he'd sent to the media. Bank transfers, false tax filings, and communications with other victims she'd scammed in the past. Lena's arrogance didn't falter immediately. She denied everything, even as investigators combed through her records. But when Sophie's emails and their damning contents were presented, her bravado cracked. Ethan had seen to it that Lena couldn't throw Sophie under the bus without incriminating herself further. The next morning, Lena was arrested on charges of fraud and tax evasion. Her name, once associated with charm and confidence, now became synonymous with deceit and scandal. Meanwhile, Ethan made sure Sophie couldn't hide from the fallout. The affair was now public knowledge, and whispers of her betrayal spread like wildfire through their social circles. Friends and family who once adored her turned their backs, disgusted by her duplicity. Sophie called Ethan that evening, her voice raw and pleading. "You've done enough damage, Ethan. Please, just stop." Ethan's response was cold and measured. "Damage?
No, Sophie.
This is justice. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. Don't call me again." He hung up, feeling a strange sense of relief. That night, he went to the house, the home Sophie had tried to take from him, and sat by the fireplace with a drink in hand. The warmth of the flames felt like the first real comfort he'd had in months. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to sleep soundly, knowing that the two people who had betrayed him were paying the price for their greed and deceit. A week later, Sophie appeared at Ethan's doorstep, her face pale and drawn. Her once polished demeanor had crumbled, and the desperation in her eyes was unmistakable. Ethan hesitated for a moment before letting her in, wanting to hear whatever excuse or plea she had prepared. "I've lost everything, Ethan," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "Lena's gone, my friends, my family. No one will even speak to me anymore." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, his expression unmoved. "And you're here because? Because I want you to understand," Sophie said, her voice breaking. "What happened with Lena, it wasn't just about the money or the house. It was complicated." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Then explain it to me. Make me understand why you destroyed our marriage for her." Sophie hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. "Lena and I, we've known each other since college. We were together back then, but She paused, her voice faltering. "I was scared. Scared of what people would think. Scared of what my family would say. So I ended things with her and chose a safer path. I chose you." Ethan felt the sting of those words, but he didn't flinch. "And then what? You decided to rekindle things behind my back? Use me until I wasn't convenient anymore." "It wasn't like that," Sophie protested, tears spilling down her cheeks. "At least not at first. But when Lena came back into my life, all those feelings came rushing back. I thought we could have it all. The money, the house, the freedom to finally be together." Her confession was like a slap in the face. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that Ethan had been nothing more than a shield for Sophie's fears, a placeholder in a life she never truly wanted. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "You thought you could use me to fund your escape with her? That I'd just roll over and let it happen?" Sophie reached for his hand, but Ethan pulled away. "I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan," she whispered. I didn't know how else to get out." "And now?" Ethan asked, his voice cold. "What do you want from me now?" "I don't know," Sophie admitted, her voice barely audible. I didn't know where else to go." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, a wave of pity rising despite his anger. She looked so small, so broken. But then he remembered the lies, the schemes, the betrayal. "You're right about one thing," Ethan said finally. "You don't have anywhere else to go. And you won't find what you're looking for here." Sophie's shoulders sagged, her tears falling freely as Ethan opened the door. "Goodbye, Sophie," he said firmly. She hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. The door closed behind her with a finality that felt like the last chapter of a book Ethan would never reopen. After Sophie's departure, Ethan stood by the door for a long moment, letting the silence of the house settle around him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of closure. The weight of her betrayal was still there, but it no longer crushed him. It was simply a part of his story now, a scar he would carry but no longer let define him. He spent the following days restoring his life piece by piece. The house, once a source of contention, became his sanctuary again. He stripped the walls of reminders of Sophie, clearing out old photographs and items that carried too much pain. In their place, he hung new artwork, chose brighter colors, and brought in plants to breathe life into the space. Sophie's scandal with Lena continued to ripple through their community. News outlets painted a damning picture of their scheme, highlighting Lena's arrest and Sophie's role in the betrayal. Ethan's friends rallied around him, offering support and commending him for how he handled the fallout. One evening, as Ethan was sitting in the freshly redecorated living room, his lawyer called. "You'll be pleased to know Sophie signed the divorce agreement," the lawyer said. "It's all done. She didn't contest anything." Ethan exhaled deeply, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "Thanks," he said, "for everything. She's lucky you didn't take her for more," the lawyer added. Ethan chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "She's already lost enough." The days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself settling into a new rhythm. He focused on his work, took up hobbies he had long neglected, and even began reconnecting with friends he hadn't seen in years. Slowly but surely, he was reclaiming his life. And yet, in quiet moments, he would think about Sophie and Lena. Not with longing or regret, but with a detached curiosity. He wondered if they were still in touch, if Sophie had found a way to forgive herself for what she'd done. But those thoughts were fleeting, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had emerged from the chaos stronger, wiser, and free. Months passed, and the wounds Sophie and Lena had left began to heal. The house, once a battleground for their betrayal, became a symbol of Ethan's resilience. Each repaired wall, every refurbished room, felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. One evening, while going through old belongings in the attic, Ethan found a photo album from his childhood. Flipping through the pages, he smiled at the memories. Birthday parties, family holidays, quiet moments in the garden with his parents. The house had been the backdrop for so much love and joy. For a while, he had feared it would only remind him of the pain Sophie and Lena had caused. But now it felt like his again. The community's whispers about Sophie and Lena eventually faded, replaced by new scandals and gossip. Ethan never learned exactly where Sophie had gone after their final conversation. Lena, as far as he knew, was still entangled in legal battles. Occasionally, he would catch sight of Sophie's name in a social media post or overhear her mentioned in passing. It stirred no emotion in him now, just a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter closed. One rainy afternoon, Ethan decided to visit the local cafe where he had often gone with Sophie in better days. As he sipped his coffee, a woman approached his table, a familiar face from the neighborhood. "I just wanted to say," she began hesitantly, "you handled everything with such grace. It couldn't have been easy." Ethan offered a small smile. "It wasn't, but life goes on." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Well, if you ever want company for coffee, let me know." He watched her leave, a slight warmth spreading through him. For the first time in a long while, he felt open to the idea of moving forward, not to forget but to build something new. That evening, as he stood on the porch of his house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan felt a quiet sense of peace. The storm Sophie and Lena had brought into his life was over, leaving him with hard-earned clarity. Revenge had been satisfying, but rebuilding had been healing. Ethan had weathered the betrayal, and now, he was ready for whatever came next. The future was his, untainted and full of promise.